Welcome to another video lecture. Tonight we're going to talk about Book 7 of Plato's Republic. When he talks about... Oh, getting a lot of feedback. Can I mute my microphone?
Maybe that's me. Let me see.
There, I just muted and unmuted. Okay, cool. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about Book 7 of Plato's Republic, in which he talks about the famous cave allegory. So I wanted to give you maybe a little bit of background about what's going on here with the Republic. This is one of the later dialogues that Plato wrote, and you'll notice like the main person who's speaking in it is Socrates, and Socrates was a real person. He was an actual philosopher. He was the teacher of Plato, so Plato was Socrates' student, and we don't really have any writings left from Socrates. It doesn't seem like maybe he even wrote anything at all. That he just did philosophy with talking with people and thinking. But Plato uses him as like a character in a lot of his dialogues. Now these dialogues, some of them are, we think, somewhat historically accurate, like the trial and death of Socrates, we think is like at least pretty close to maybe what happened. It doesn't seem completely like a fantasy, like mythological story or something like that. It looks like we know that some of these events actually happened, and that Plato is kind of telling us the story on some of this stuff. But generally, the earlier dialogues from Plato, we think, are more like what Socrates actually thought. That Plato, as his student, was just sort of recording down his teacher's words and trying to like preserve them for posterity and that sort of thing. But once we start rolling into the later dialogues, then Plato is really just using Socrates as like a sock puppet to talk with, where it's really Plato's ideas, but it's still put into these like dramatic settings of Socrates talking with his students. So that's what's happening here. The Republic is one of the later dialogues. Socrates' philosophy is generally, a lot of the dialogues work something like this. Socrates is hanging out on the streets of Athens with a bunch of the youth of the city. A lot of them, the like children of the rich and powerful of Athens. And they're just talking about some philosophy topics, about some part of reality, and asking questions about it. Maybe their topic for the day is something like courage, and then a like general walks by, or some other like person that's like well-to-do in society who would normally be considered like an authority about this sort of thing, and overhears the conversation and is like, "Oh, you're talking about courage. Well, I'm the one who knows everything about courage. I'm a general," and that sort of thing. And then Socrates is usually like, "Well, I don't actually know anything about courage. I'm totally ignorant about this. Maybe you can be my teacher. Maybe you can teach me about this thing that I don't know anything about." And there's kind of this, it's almost, there's a lot of discussion about how to interpret Socrates here. Is he just playing? Is he just pretending to be dumb or something? Or is he really sincerely thinking that he doesn't know anything and he wants to learn from other people's experience? I don't know, but that's how a lot of the drama ends up happening. And then the person who thinks that they know everything gives their answer, and then Socrates starts asking questions about it, like poking at it, like poking holes at it, and they start having to make up new claims to defend the claims that they've already made, and pretty soon they land themselves in a lot of trouble, and their argument kind of falls apart, and their idea, which looked good at the beginning or seemed intuitive, turned out to not make so much sense. Usually by this point in the conversation, the person is pissed off at Socrates and leaves without there being like really any kind of resolution. They're like, "Yeah, I gotta go, so see ya. This has been not so much fun. I'm out of here." And then Socrates is usually like, "I guess I'll never know." And then they roll end credits. That's like how almost every single Socratic dialogue works. And in a few exception cases, that really is the pattern. But when the exceptions happen, they're notable. And the Republic is another exception case. In the Republic, Socrates is just like expounding his view. He's just laying down a systematic view about what justice is and what the just society should look like. That's what the Republic is all about. It's about justice, or you might say morality, and both on the terms of what does that look like for an individual and what it should look like for society. So that's what's going on here. This is pretty deep into the Republic. The selection I had you guys read, this book 7 thing, where they're specifically wanting to talk about education as like a part of how society should function. But Plato really doesn't think of things in terms of their like logistics or their nitty gritty details. He's always he definitely takes a really broad vision toward all of his topics. And that's no different here. Like when he's talking about education, he's talking about education, like everything that could count as education. Learning from life experience versus, I mean, it's not just, we're not just talking here about some kind of institutionalized learning, but any kind of learning at all is what he wants to talk about. So as we were talking about this morning, the main topic here is what is education and what sort of effect does it have on the soul? Actually, the way here, I'll bring up the document, and maybe for those of you in the live feed here, it might be handy to have the reading in front of you too. Maybe have it available to pull up here. The first sentence, he says, oh, and sometimes there's some grammar weirdness here. Sometimes it might have been confusing. Like here at the beginning, he says, "Next, I said, blankety blank." The full dramatic setting here for the Republic is Socrates is telling someone else about a conversation he had with a bunch of separate people on a separate occasion. So if you're kind of like, why is it being in all this dramatic format? Well, there's even a weird meta-narrative happening on this one too. So if you were wondering about some of that grammar stuff, that's what's going on. So he's sort of like, after that part of the conversation, the next thing I said was, compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. So the whole metaphor of this cave and everything is supposed to be a metaphor of what we're like, what human beings are like when we have education and when we don't have it. So again, like I said this morning, very similar to Russell in that Plato wants to talk about how learning or doing philosophy, seeking the truth, is something that affects how we experience life, what kind of characters we have, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's enough of a little bit of an introduction here to get started. I did mention this thing about how Plato thinks that education is not a matter of just transmitting information, but it's a matter of redirecting attention. And maybe that's a good place to start, but again, like with Russell, I'm kind of wanting this to go wherever you guys want it to go with it. I want to kind of paint the picture together. So I gave a little bit of backstory there. And maybe I'll ask you guys what you're seeing Plato talking about here. Like what are, and in particular, let's try to focus on the first part of the reading first. I gave you guys that selection from the end of book 7 too, and the story of the bastard, which maybe we can save for like half an hour from now or something like that. We'll pick up the bastard story. But for now, let's focus just on the cave allegory. And what do you think Plato is trying to say about education and the effect on people with the elements of that metaphor? What do you see going on there?
When we follow in the reading, can we kind of list what page we're on? Because it's so much there that I'm having trouble keeping up.
Absolutely. The thing I just read was from the first page, the very first sentence on the first paragraph here.
The next I said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's what I just read. And that's the basic idea of the metaphor, like the basic setup. But then he starts building in extra details to it. And, yeah.
Is he kind of saying like people who haven't been exposed to certain outside elements aren't necessarily people who are ready to kind of see that kind of stuff? You know, he was talking about on page like 1133 paragraph, like what was it? I don't know where it is on this page. Hold on. Let's see. I wish I could Control F and find something on here. You can come back to me if you want to, if somebody else wants to chime in.
Okay, I'm getting a bunch of texts from people who are trying to join that showed up late. So maybe we're going to take a little time out, and I'm going to get them in on the loop, and then we'll kick it back up again. But think about that. Like, think about what you think Plato is trying to say with the different elements of the allegory. Some of it he explains. Like, there are some passages here where he's like, by this I mean this. Especially you might look at page 4 of the PDF, which in the page numbers is 1135b, where he connects some of the dots explicitly. But there's other stuff that's very suggestive and that we kind of have to decode. So I'm going to take a little time out here, and then we'll get back. Let me get
A little perplexed at this one part. It might be a little inconsequential to what he's trying to say.
Actually, just I'm going to cut you off for a second here. I still wanted to address some more things from Lawrence's comment here. This part, Lawrence has in the chat feed, for those of you watching the video later here on YouTube, Lawrence was wondering about the differences or the distinction between education in circumstances of like third world countries or places where there's a big difference of economic status. And I was thinking that Plato doesn't really address this sort of thing because his world doesn't have it in the same way that ours does. And there is no real systematic or formalized, institutionalized education going on in Plato's day. Plato is responsible for really starting a lot of that. However, I think if he was going to be here today, he would talk about how education is possible across the board here. It doesn't matter. And in fact, I mean, a lot of let's dive to page 4 for a second. This was where Plato starts connecting some of the dots for us about what the metaphor is supposed to mean. He says, so this is at the top of page 4 of the PDF, or in the notation in the book, it's 1135b. And he says, this whole image, Glaucon, must be fitted together with what we said before. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you'll grasp what I hope to convey, since that is what you wanted to hear about. Whether it's true or not, only the God knows, but this is how I see it. And I'm gonna stop there. What Plato thinks, at least what he's saying here, he means by the metaphor. And a lot of other people have interpreted the allegory of the cave in different ways. But what Plato is saying about it has a little bit to do with his own philosophy. He thinks his own particular philosophical views. Plato thinks that the world of objects and the senses is not really the true reality. It's like a dream. It has just a pale reflection of the real reality, which is the realm of what he calls the forms, which are these universals, essences that exist, that reason can help us get in contact with. Plato thinks that when we're using concepts, when we're thinking about abstract concepts, we're actually thinking about the forms. And other objects, like even a phone. This is a particular phone. It's not the embodiment of all phones in general. Hey, Daniel, can you mute your microphone? I think it's getting some feedback. Thanks. So you've got, here's a phone, and it's not the embodiment of all phones or phoneness or something like that. But when I see this thing, I think phone. And that means that I'm like applying a universal abstract to this particular situation. This particular object reflects something of phoneness, and that's why I think about it in this way. And that might sound a little backwards to us, but let's talk about it with some more of the weirder concepts, or the ones we think of as more abstract, like beauty, justice, and especially for Plato, the really important one here is the form of the good. So whenever I encounter an object and I'm like, that's beautiful, it's got some particularities about it that reflect some part of what beauty is in totality. So it's reflecting just a certain facet of this whole beauty thing. But what we frequently do is we locate the beauty in the object rather than seeing the object as just reflecting this deeper reality of the beauty. So, and this might sound really counterintuitive and wacky. Even to people in Plato's own day, it sounded a little wacky. But this is what Plato thought. So he thinks that everything that's happening in the world of the senses is basically like that weird shadow dance that's happening in the back of the cave that the prisoners think is reality. They think that's all there is to it. Like reality just is these shadows, and that's it. And then when they leave the cave, then they see the wider world of what's going on. Well, Plato thinks that's like thinking about the universals. So, to bring it back to your comment, Lawrence, if Plato was alive today and he was looking at life in like a first world developed country and life in a third world country, he might say something like, "There's all of these things in developed countries in like modern lifestyle that are really distracting the senses. There's a lot of sensory distraction going on, and that's going to distract you from thinking about what are the true universals. That'll put your attention on the wrong things. The more that your attention is fixated on just objects and circumstances, particular circumstances within this world, that's like that's putting the attention not where you're going to be able to derive true deep insight about reality. Only when you're thinking about things in terms of the universals and not getting distracted by the particulars that you gain that sort of wisdom. That's Plato's view. Whatever you guys think of it, I'm curious about. But this is what he argues. And we could understand, I mean, in as much as I'm offering this cave allegory as a way to think about philosophy, I don't think we need to stick to just what Plato meant by it. I think we can speculate. There might be, again, some points that still stand, even if we don't agree with Plato's metaphysical picture here about the forms and material objects being illusions and stuff like that. So, does that make sense? Is my explanation making sense? You guys have any questions about the forms?
Nobody has anything to say. Could I give my 2 cents about it?
Absolutely, dude.
Cool. So, sorry. The way it came across to me was, it kind of seemed like he was explaining the way in which people are shown, or I guess like what we're doing. We're in a philosophy class to have our eyes opened and our perspectives broadened, and it kind of feels like that his allegory is kind of like what we're in the process of doing right now, almost. Like he's talking about how you're in kind of like in darkness, you're believing one way, and you've believed that one way your entire life, and it's once and imagine somebody told you, like for instance, imagine you told us a totally different way of looking at things. At first it's painful and it's like, oh god, this like sucks to be able to look at or to be able to or have to look at this from a different perspective. Everything I know is like a lie. But in the end, it's kind of like eventually they kind of come around and they're like, oh, this is actually a better way of doing things than I thought it was. Or this is a better perspective of doing things than I used to hold. I don't know.
Like when Russell talks about the whole how philosophy frees you from the tyranny of custom, that sounds pretty close to what Plato has in mind here. How the prisoners are like shackled to the cave floor. Like I always imagine whenever I read the cave allegory, I think of Clockwork Orange, where like the guy's in the movie theater and he's got those things holding his eyes open. You guys know? Yeah, right. So they're in one way, at certain parts in the story, they seem to endorse their life or prefer it to leaving the cave, right? But at the same time, they're prisoners. They're trapped there, and the correlate for like seeking the truth and doing philosophy is like running around in the world totally free. So I think that the point that you're making definitely is there in the Plato for sure.
Yeah, it was like I thought when he was talking about how they were, they're all prisoners, but they're all okay with being prisoners. It's like if you think about it, we're all just kind of prisoners of our own minds in some way or another, and we're all somewhat okay with that. Like we're all like nobody's like, oh yeah, like you don't go every day looking at every single person being like, damn, I wish I had his like this aspect of his life, and I wish I had that aspect of his life. Like it's not like you're trying to pick parts out of other people's lives that it's you're just happy with who maybe there's some flaws that you have, but on the whole you're happy with yourself.
That might be building in another element, like this theme of contentment. I don't see Plato kind of drawing attention to quite as much. I mean, there's
Well, I guess I don't mean contentment. It's like that none of them question. They're not questioning anything. They're all they just do everything kind of without. It almost seems like they do everything natural. They do everything naturally. Our thought process is natural. It's not like we manipulated or like something manipulated our thought process. But that's just kind of how our life is played out. Um, and that's kind of like the way that we just see, the way we see things is the way we see things, and we're okay with it.
I kind of want to bring up another part of the story at this point. So there after the guy gets pulled out of the cave, kicking and screaming, right? He slowly acclimates to encountering the truth directly, and then he kind of needs to be. Then he's like, "This is dope. I'm down with this. This is great." And then he takes some convincing to go back to the cave. But Plato's like, there is a natural motive here. I mean, if you had your eyes open to this and be like, oh man, I was living in this cave and that was crazy, and I would never want to go back and have that kind of existence, then there's kind of a spontaneous motive of compassion that leads the guy to go back down into the cave and try to like spread the word, right? To like get other people to see what he saw. Um, and there, but then this part of the story shows up. Plato says, um, wouldn't people like ridicule him for not being able to see clearly what's going on with the shadows or talk the shadow talk? I always imagine like it's kind of like people today like watching television shows and being like, "Hey, do you know what happened on this?" Like the first time I taught Plato's Republic, Lost was still going on, and all my students, I came into the classroom and they're like, "Did you watch Lost last night? What do you think is going to happen? Like, what happened with what's really going on with this character and that sort of thing?" And I was like, "This is exactly what Plato's talking about. People watching the shadows, these like fake stories of the shadows doing things and making predictions about how they're going to behave. And it's all really arbitrary, but they think that they're smart and they know what's happening. And then the person comes down back into the cave. Their eyes can't adjust to the darkness, and they kind of don't care about this game anymore, so they don't play it very well. And people think that they're dumb. And then when the person is like, everything you know is a lie, let me show you real reality, everyone's going to think they're just crazy. And Plato says, wouldn't they, if they could get their hands on him, because they're shackled down, but if they could get their hands on him, wouldn't they try to kill him? And this is a direct reference to how Socrates was killed by the people of Athens. So I was telling you that a lot of times Socrates is like hanging out with the students and talking about things, and then he kind of gets into these debates with figures in society. Well, he pissed off a bunch of people, and they didn't like him, and so they eventually were able to take him to trial on trumped up charges that he was corrupting the youth by preaching, which was basically something kind of like a pseudo monotheism sort of thing against the polytheism of Athenian Greek religion. So he said that he was corrupting the youth, and at the trial of Socrates, he gets condemned to die, and then he, instead of escaping the city, accepts the punishment that was handed down, drinks hemlock, and dies. So Plato, I think, is kind of like, that's like a little reference to what happened to Socrates and being like, hey, this is for real. The stakes are high. I know. I've seen it. I've been there. That happened. So I think that's another component of this, that people are going to put up some kind of resistance to this. Like, not only are we kind of like victims, but we're also like actively attached to these illusions or to these habits and ways of thinking that we're comfortable with, or that maybe cater to making us feel smart or powerful or whatever, right? There's all sorts of reasons why we might go along with the habits that custom has left us with, or that is getting preached to us from society or from our parents or from whatever. There's some backlogged comments here in the chat that I kind of want to address a little bit too. Lawrence asks whether the forms would be considered the representation of all objects of that type, or an abstract like beauty, as you mentioned, being seen through an object like the phone. Okay, if you're wondering a little bit more about the forms are not concepts. Even though that might be how we think of them. We think of an abstract object as maybe like a concept, like the concept of three. Like there's no threes running around. The three is a concept that I use to make sense of reality and something like that, but it's not like there are three as an object like a phone or a mouse or something. Plato thinks that these things are real, that they actually exist. Like there is another object in existence. It's not a physical object. It's this other kind of abstract entity, but it's as real as physical objects. It just exists in its own way. And Plato uses kind of similar to this the notion of the mind. The mind is something that we are like directly acquainted with and experience, and the mind doesn't seem like a physical thing. Think about like from the inside what consciousness is like. It doesn't feel like something physical. It's not. I don't do things with consciousness the way I do things with physical objects. They're on different levels. They have different types of realities. This is a kind of it's called idealism, or if you think physical objects exist too, kind of dualism, that a person is like a physical object with like a mental object thing too, your mind and your body. Those are the kind of two elements. And so Plato thinks that the forms have existence on the same level that like a mind has existence, that reason has existence. And that's why reason is capable of getting us in touch with the forms, of like perceiving them. The way that I perceive physical objects with my eyeballs, I perceive the forms with reason. Reason is like another perceptual faculty. I just need to use that sense. I need to be directing my attention to it. The same way that I can be like, my eyes are open right now, but I could be just focusing more on what I hear than what I see. Like, where am I locating my attention in consciousness? If I'm thinking about like philosophy, then I'm like putting my attention on the like rational level of existence of reality, which all things like physical objects just sort of reflect parts of those realities of the forms. That's about as much as I want to say about the forms tonight, because I don't want to. It was kind of like we got distracted on the whole what is Russell saying, what's the self defined by sort of thing last time, and I want to kind of stick to like what is Plato trying to say about doing philosophy rather than getting too hung up on his metaphysics too. Certainly this part about freedom that's getting brought up, I think that's a pretty big deal for Socrates or for Plato in this whole thing about how the people in the cave are prisoners. They're shackled down. They're prevented from being able to take on a wider view. Whenever I tell this story and we talk about it in a philosophy club, usually there's a student who asks like, what the hell is going on with the people who are running this whole game? Like the people have chained up all these prisoners and are doing the shadow dances 24 hours. Like, what's up with them? Like, what role do they play in this story? And I like that too, because maybe there is some role that they're playing as well. That there's like people in society that maybe want people to be prisoners in this sort of way, or that might even engineer this. They're kind of free to walk around, but they've chained up some other people to prevent them from learning and growing and that sort of thing. So I think that's always an interesting part of the story too. I feel like I'm talking a lot, and I want you guys to talk some more. So tell me more of what you guys are seeing in the story. Yeah, Alexa, you're seeing this element of like a moral obligation to share the truth after you've had kind of an encounter with it, because of how this sort of truth-seeking thing is connected with freedom. Like that's a kind of a basic moral value that we might care about. Yeah, and I do like that Plato brought that element in about he's like there's two ways that people can be confused, two ways that people can be like having trouble making sense of things, or it could be like having a kind of blindness. It could be when they move from darkness to lightness, that they're confused by the light, right? But that's something weird. So that it sounds like they don't know what they're talking about because they don't know what they're talking about. They're just starting out with that encounter of what's real. They're moving from ignorance into knowledge. But then he says the same sort of it still looks like that too, even when you have encountered truth and then you head back into shadow. You enter into the shadow realm. That's also a place where you can like have this weird blindness phenomenon happen. I always thought that was a very interesting point by him, and I like maybe worth more thinking. Maybe I can get more out of it. Rob sees religious leaders as the people running the cave. They generally try to dazzle their audience and keep them from critically examining and questioning their beliefs. And then Alexa's like, oh my God, I agree. I think religion is designed to remove knowledge from the masses, especially Christianity. I want to respectfully disagree with you guys about this. I was actually just having a conversation with a student earlier today about how much we felt like religious perspectives get misunderstood and not really listened to for what they are and seen as in a kind of more superficial light than I think they really deserve. A lot of religious traditions are inviting the kind of critical self-examination that philosophy is also inviting people into. Most religious traditions are trying to get people to be much more intentional with how they make their choices in their life and be responsible with how they live. And in my mind, if I was going to imagine someone as like trying to keep people from thinking and something like that, I might much more quickly look to something like Hollywood or television crews or something like that as like or video game companies or things like that as being like those are the people who are just like here's some stuff to distract you in your life and you don't have to think very deeply about stuff. I don't think that I mean I can certainly grant that there are plenty of examples of people within religious contexts who have anti-intellectual tendencies or who are trying to shut down conversation or just be very, very loud with their voice and aren't as willing to charitably engage with their opponents too. But that's a real universal human phenomenon. I don't know if I could particularly single out religion for that. And I don't think that they are very structurally designed to do that sort of thing, to discourage truth seeking. Let's see here. Some more people are talking about it. Josiah says, some religious leaders, yeah. I think the current pope is doing a good job of advocating good human values rather than good Christian values or good Catholic values or something. So maybe Josiah, you're saying that he's not being as tribalistic about this? I mean, I'm not sure. Cameron says, if anyone wants a religion test, I don't know what HMU stands for. I'll show you the logic that proves atheism. Oh, hit me up. Oh, okay, cool, thanks. I'm not completely hip to the jive here. Lawrence says, I disagree. In my experience, Christianity causes a lot of self-reflection and analysis of one's own action. That's what I'm kind of saying too. Although doctrine or those in power don't want people to think, hinder that process. I have definitely seen that happen in church communities and in religious communities too. Those trends are there. I mean, like I said, I think this is a human dynamic. I don't think religions have a monopoly on this sort of thing. I see it happening all over the place. That doesn't give an excuse because everyone's doing it or something like that. But I don't think that it's specifically religion that's kind of the culprit here. Okay. And I feel like religion can monopolize the philosophical conversation. I have not found that to be true. Most philosophers are atheists or at least agnostic, and religion doesn't come up so much in professional philosophical discourse. Maybe if you're talking about like certain like philosophical discussions that might take place informally, and then people bring in religion to it, I mean, that makes sense to me because religion is trying to basically do the same sort of thing that philosophy is doing. It's trying to give a perspective about how to look at reality and how to act in reality. So I can see a lot of connection there with that. Um, yeah, casual philosophy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I religion is something that people abuse like they abuse everything. I think anything that's good, people find a way to screw it up. And I think religion's kind of in that boat too. But I'm gonna say at this point, I'm gonna stop the religion conversation. If you guys want to talk about that more sometime, I very much welcome that kind of conversation. But I think it's getting us a little bit away from Plato here, because Plato he's not really talking about religion. He certainly isn't singling out religion as a culprit here, or really playing some kind of role in the whole thing. Um, Plato does. I did say that Plato has a kind of monotheism, but he really, I mean, his God is the form of the good, and whether he thinks of that thing as that abstract entity of this like perfect goodness thing as even having a personality, that's kind of up for debate. But it's more like this sort of universal reality that Plato is talking about when he usually is talking about God, and he certainly doesn't really buy into the ancient Greek polytheistic religion thing. That's not really his game. Um, yeah, I love talking about religion and philosophy because I think it's an often neglected topic, and I think I told you guys that everyone needs to feel comfortable in this conversation. And if you have religious perspectives or you have philosophical views that are informed by a religious tradition, you have a place at this table in having this conversation. You do need to engage critically. You have to like give argument for your position and defend it. But I want you to feel welcome in the conversation. It's not like because we're talking secular philosophy, no religion allowed or something like that. That can't work that way. We got to keep all these voices in the conversation. I'm very passionate about that. And it might be a little tricky to figure out how to bridge those two things, or either if you are religious, how do I engage in philosophy in light of that, or if you're not religious or you are maybe pretty hostile toward religion, how can you engage with someone who is religious in a philosophical conversation? How can you make that work? I have a lot of advice about both of those things. I've thought about them a lot. I have a lot of experience with them, and I'm happy to share that with you and talk to you and help you work that out if you want. But let's get back to Plato, and not on religion. Um, I said in about a half an hour I want to talk about the bastard story. Do you guys have anything else from the cave allegory that you really want to talk about or discuss, or that you think is important that we haven't mentioned yet, or something you're confused by? Anything like that at all? What's going on?
I have something.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out what he means by the statement on page 2.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest paragraph on there at the end of it says, or to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by and asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss, and he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he was being shown?
Yeah.
Is that like a reference to ignorance once shown the truth, or is that?
Yeah, it's talking about that moment where the person's attention is first directed from what they're used to what's unfamiliar. So maybe like the first time you crack open a philosophy book, or you like read Plato for the first time, the things that you're being shown will look fake. They'll look like an illusion, like a myth or a story, rather than something that is real. And you'll think that the stuff that you're already familiar with is more real than the thing you're being shown, even if it has more reality to it. Because it's unfamiliar and strange, it'll seem more unreal. That's what Plato's saying. That makes sense?
So you're saying it's just more of the painful transition to knowledge, not necessarily. Okay.
I think that's what he's going for here. Um, yeah, he doesn't have, if you're first being brought into this new world and you're being asked questions about it that you're expected to answer, and you don't have anything to work with. Like, I know I'm kind of doing that. I'm throwing you guys this reading and then being like, tell me about it. What's going on here? But I'm like not going to do that when we start reading the stuff next week. If I just threw at you like the Perry reading, or especially if I threw the Parfit reading, the second reading we're going to have next week, If I just threw that at you and was like, tell me what's going on here, it'd be pretty hard. It'd be really, really hard for you to do that. And it might be like, what are we even talking about anymore? This doesn't seem, I don't have any frame of reference for this. This isn't accessible to me. I don't see the reality, even though the object's right in front of me. My lack of familiarity with it, the fact that I'm still getting a handle on its strangeness, sort of thing. That's why I'm gonna experience it as more unreal. I think that's what Plato's saying. Remember, he thinks that there's this kind of like transition period. You encounter the thing, but you don't, grasp it right away. But it takes some like sustained, concentrated attention, and then the thing starts to reveal its nature to you. I was talking with someone else outside of class about how, oh no, it was a student I randomly met on the bus today. We were talking a little bit about listening, and he was saying that he was doing this little exercise where he was like, I'm gonna just believe whatever anyone tells me for a week just because I'm so critical, and every time I hear something, I'm immediately judgmental about it. He wanted to like do this exercise to get him to like listen more and try to be charitable. Actually, and I was like, wow, it's kind of interesting. I wouldn't do it very long. That kind of uncritical acceptance is probably not a good idea. But as like a little exercise, I thought it was kind of interesting. And definitely he thought that, and I agree with him on this, that finding out what is a thing's true nature is not something that immediate exposure to it shows you. That it takes some time, it takes some listening or sitting with it to really grasp what's going on with that reality. I think that's right. I think that's right. Rob says it's hard to accept something someone describes and you don't have any understanding of. Until you experience it yourself, it's hard to accept. Although someone describing it often helps you proceed to experience it yourself. Yeah, and that's what I think Plato thinks of as the role of education or educators. All they can do is kind of like report back about their experience and maybe get you to point your attention in a certain direction, but it's always up to you. Like I was saying this morning, like a teacher can't tell you what's true. They can't convince you by just even saying, "Well, I think it's true." Not when we're talking about wisdom or a deep understanding of reality. That's definitely how Plato sees it. Any other things you guys want to ask about or jump in on here?
I got something I'd like to talk about. He discusses at the end of this section how he thinks enlightened people, knowledgeable people, should be the political rulers.
Yeah.
But I have some very different thoughts on that. An enlightened person, as he's describing, who's left behind desires for political power, worldly power, material things, would be a better ruler, but I just don't think they could. They have left all that stuff behind. They have left behind the idea of trying to use force to obtain what they want or what they need. And in a situation where you had an enlightened person leading, ruling, he even says they would be distracted from that for the pursuit of truth and philosophy and stuff.
They'd rather not be there. That's true. But Plato addresses this problem. This is something that he brings up. One of the other students brings up this kind of objection. I think maybe in the passages I sent, maybe not. Maybe it comes up in another part of the Republic. I think it's in this section. Though he says, there's like 5 years of intense training in philosophy, and then there's 15 years of learning how to do the basic logistics of civilization, including, or like running a society, including warfare. They're supposed to be trained in war. So Plato thinks that this dynamic that you're speaking to is a real dynamic, and that's why he wants to address it directly. He doesn't think that there's any reason why once people have been brought into the light, the enlightenment space of like discovering wisdom and truth, that they can't be brought back to understanding and putting attention on trying to become capable leaders who can do the sorts of things that are required to run a government, so to speak. that's the part about how he says because they're going to do this, not because they want to, because they don't want to. They wouldn't. They'd rather not be bothered with running governments and stuff like that. They'd rather just be thinking about philosophy the whole time. But they will be compelled to, because if they are philosophers who have found the truth or have had this kind of enlightenment, then they are just people, and they recognize their responsibility to serve society and their fellow man and that sort of thing. So they will be compelled to serve and do these tasks they don't want to do. And Plato at least thinks that there's nothing stopping them in terms of having the big picture philosophy, wisdom kind of knowledge, and then also having the kind of on the ground pragmatic, here's how you do this job sort of knowledge too.
Okay, they might have some knowledge of warfare, they might have some knowledge of stuff, but they are, as he describes, focused in a different direction on the good. And other people who desire this power, he was saying, they're focused on the bad, and they are good at focusing on the bad and understanding it. A person enlightened like that, even if they've been trained in war, is not going to have the proclivity, the just talent for scheming and viciousness and everything else that would be needed for him to defend his rule from without the society and from within the society. And he would be constantly besieged.
I think he kind of points to the fact that they both have sharp wit, and so I think the good person can still compete in that fashion because they also have the sharp wit. Maybe not like the viciousness and conniving, but maybe the smarts to see it.
And they will be restrained by justice. They're not gonna do certain types of atrocities that maybe someone else would do, and that might make them more powerful. But now we're talking about like power versus morality, and getting even further afield. I think at this point, I think in some ways it's speculative about whether they would be smarter or not smarter or whatever. I don't know, but I kind of want to get back onto uh, doing philosophy rather than the running of government stuff. That is a part of the Republic. That is the broader picture of the Republic. But in this particular section of it, the focus mostly sticks to just the education stuff. I think it's time because we are running out of time. I definitely want to talk about this bastard story, so I'm going to get to that. And I think we will. Wait, why not? We'll use Lawrence's suggestion for the code word tonight. Code word is triangle. Triangle is the code word. Okay. So the very end of the reading, last couple pages here. Let's see. Picks up on page 21 of the PDF, or in the thing it'd be 1152, section E. Okay, so Plato starts off saying this with the story. Don't you realize that a great evil comes from dialectic as it is currently practiced? And what he means by dialectic is just the back and forth of like philosophical debate. And he thinks there's a lot of problems with it. There's a great evil that's going on in it. I want to address this because the whole first part really is this kind of philosophical propaganda. If you buy into the model of reality that Plato is laying down at the beginning of book 7, it really sounds like you're like, I don't want to be the prisoner. I want to be the guy who's free from the cave, obviously. So sign me up for this philosophy thing because I don't want to be a prisoner, right? So that's kind of like all about singing the praises of philosophy and how it will transform your life and make you an awesome person. And I think some of that stuff is true. But I also like how Plato recognizes that philosophy is not all awesome. It's got its problems. There's some risks here. There's ways that it can go wrong. And that's what he's talking about at the end of the book here with this bastard story, this metaphor of the bastard. Can I just get a quick poll from people who are here in the live stream here? How much sense did this make? Did it read off the page pretty well? Do you understand the point of the bastard metaphor? I'm trying to kind of decide how much to explain it, how much time to spend explaining it right now. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, maybe I will just go for it here. Okay. So maybe I'll pull up part of the text here so people can follow along if they're watching on YouTube. Um, so the evil that Plato thinks is going on is that those who practice it are filled with lawlessness. They're filled with lawlessness. People who are engaging in debate are not constraining their behavior appropriately or acting intentionally. I mean, this is lawlessness. That there's a lack of boundary when there needs to be a boundary, where people need to constrain their behavior in certain ways, where that would be appropriate. And here's a story that he tells. Um, imagine imagine a kid who thinks that his parents are his real parents. And like all parents, they kind of like want to tell him what to do, and they teach him, values and why wisdom that they've got and stuff like that. And the son, because he respects them as his parents, is like, I believe you. I mean, you're my parents. I'm gonna go along with this, and this is all well and good. And Plato describes how, like, if there were these people, these like I always imagine this kind of like cartoon characters or something. They're like, "Hey man, you want to do some crack or something?" He's like, "No, I don't want to do that. I've got my values and principles from my parents. Thank you. I'm going to obey my parents because I've got this respect for them." Plato calls them the flatterers, like people who are trying to really just like offer temptations to like not live by his principles, but by to be ruled by his desires or by self-interest or something like that, to not live a principled life. The man in the early part of this story is not going to fall for it. He's not going to fall into the trap of these temptations. But then the story changes. Then Plato says, what happens when he finds out that his parents are not his real parents, where he's a bastard? And at this point, Plato says, well, maybe he's going to now think he's not going to respect his parents or respect what they say. And as soon as he loses that respect for his parents, now he's more vulnerable to the flatterers. Now he's more likely to go along with it because he doesn't have anything guiding him. There's no like foundation to set direction about making decisions. So he's now more vulnerable. Now, I don't think Plato's story here, this is just an illustration. It's just a metaphor. I don't think Plato's making some kind of sweeping generalized claims here about people who are adopted or who have parents that are not their real parents won't respect them or something like that. I don't think that's that's the axe that Plato's trying to grind here. I don't think that's what he's up to. But his point, what the metaphor is supposed to stand in for is the experience that people can have really early on in their exposure to philosophy. That the man at the beginning of this story, the son at the beginning of the story, is kind of like all of us when how we like come into adolescence or adulthood as we're starting to mature. We sort of at some moment recognize that like, oh, I got a lot of these beliefs and values, and where did I get these from? I got them from my parents or from society or something like this. There are these like habitualized beliefs that are, you might say, like brainwashed or programmed into us that we hold on unreflective grounds. So they're not held critically. We just have them, and we might have habits around them, and we just believe them because we believe them. Just obey what my intuition tells me, which has been largely informed by these experiences in society and all the rest of it. Okay, so that's the setup. And when you encounter philosophy, then that stuff gets challenged. That's like the moment where the son finds out that his parents are not his true parents. That basically your basic beliefs get challenged, and you're like, oh, I've never had to stack them up against criticism or objection, and they're vulnerable. They can definitely be attacked and undermined. And when you lose faith in the thing that you had confidence about before, I think what Plato's worried about is that you lose confidence that there's anything to have confidence in, that there's any sort of like absolute principles, that you could ever hold a belief with the kind of attitude that you used to when it was held unreflectively, that you could go back to having that kind of like dedication and commitment to a belief or a value. and that instead there's a vacuum of power. If you're not going to be guided by principles, then what's going to take over are desires, instincts, inclinations, and not this kind of careful, thoughtful, defended judgment, which is the ultimate goal. That's what Plato sees as like idealistic philosophy, and he thinks the evil that's being done with people doing this activity of philosophical debating is that all they're doing is tearing shit down and not trying to build it up or have commitment to particular truths. That as he talks about it, it's a game. The phrase he uses is this is like a game of contradiction for sport. It's like a sport of contradiction. But that's what philosophers do. They run around trying to blow up each other's ideas, and everyone kind of ends the day having fun with, scars and bruises and, soot all over them because everyone gets destroyed, and, that's how it works. That's what's going on here. And he thinks this does a discredit to philosophy. And I've seen this sort of thing. I've seen it happen. I've felt the danger in myself. I've seen it happen with some of my friends. I've seen it happen in the case of some students too. That once they get exposed to some of these these like critical skeptical perspectives, then it's really hard to feel like you could ever have any kind of sincere commitment to really being like, this is really true. Remember, commitment and confidence doesn't mean you can't acknowledge your fallibility, or doesn't mean you can't hold that belief modestly, but that you have a commitment to principles or living a principled life. I mean, that's the thing that Plato is worried is going to get lost here if all you're encountering in philosophy is just the critical side of it, the destructive side of it. I kind of think about it sometimes like the post-hippie, like post-Vietnam kind of culture, that we can't trust the government anymore for anything. Like, we trusted the government, they betrayed us. They've done this countless times. We're just fools now to ever think that we could have an authentic participation with patriotism or something like that, or like any kind of like commitment to being like, yeah, the government is good, and I'm like with them, and I'm going to stand with them, and that sort of thing. Like, it's sort of like if you get burned a bunch of times, if you get betrayed a bunch of times, that can make it hard to trust again. I think it's that kind of dynamic that Plato is going for here. Okay, now there's been some stuff in the chat which I've been ignoring because I've been talking. So let me read through this for a second. And if you guys have questions you want to chime in on too, that's great. Josiah, that's an interesting question. Do you think it would be worse to have to believe whatever you're told or not believe anything at all? So if you're going to either be the naive person from the beginning of the story, or the the person who's just basically nihilistically engaging in philosophical debate. I don't know. I think I'd rather be the naive, ignorant one. I think I might commit to that. That might be a longer discussion to explore the whys of that. But I like that question. It's a thought-provoking question. The naysayers, I feel like that's just a shitty life. There's no love in that. And there can still be love even if your beliefs are kind of crappy or you're holding them kind of ignorantly. There can still be love there. Yeah, I think I'm not going to dive deeper into that can of worms right now though. But how are you guys at understanding this bastard story? Is it making sense? Is my explanation clicking? Yeah. Cool. There's nothing that's sadder to me than a conversation where people are like, they're doing philosophy, they're like talking about philosophical subject matter, and they're even getting into arguments and having debate, but the whole thing is just this big destructive shitstorm. I don't. That doesn't help us get anywhere. To just like go around pointing out how everything is stupid and wrong. I think it's probably the easiest and most tempting thing to do. It always is easier to destroy than to create. And like Alexa, you were saying earlier of like the true risk takers and brilliant people and the people that I'm inspired by and that I have deep respect for. It's the people that step out on that limb of trying to advance a positive position, knowing that there is tons of skeptical threats out there, tons of arguments that or concerns that can call their attempt into question. That's really risky. When you study some philosophy, you can get a little gun shy at recognizing all the powerful arguments that seem to subvert our attempts to have knowledge or anything at all. To like keep trying to keep putting together proposals and try them out, and then when they got problems to fix them and try again. Like that's courage, right? That's intellectual courage right there. Not just, I mean, I think that in some ways, especially with the way culture is today, it's moving more in a direction where uh, being someone who's willing to rethink the status quo is not so countercultural anymore. It's not like your livelihood is at risk. I mean, that still happens. I'm not saying that we're out of the woods on this, but it is heading in that. I see things moving more in that direction. That it's more and more socially acceptable to question things. And in some cultural circles, if you're not questioning things, that's the thing that makes you an outcast. If you aren't quite so skeptical and maybe even cynical about what's going on in the world, then uh, that might be a harder position to defend. That it might take more intellectual courage to defend a kind of optimism than a kind of critical pessimism. I think that there's some reality to that too. Rob, yeah, I think definitely some of the things that Plato is talking about syncs up with the code of intellectual conduct. Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of elements of the code are trying to give us particular advice about how to avoid what Plato's complaining about. Um, but I do think that I mean, I like how Plato calls attention to this particular event, this moment that happens in like the young philosopher's life where their beliefs get smashed, like everything that they took for granted gets destroyed. That they're in a very vulnerable position there about whether they lose confidence in seeking the truth and instead just are kind of, you might say, a false seeker instead of a truth seeker. They're looking for all the problems, and that's all that's happening, rather than trying to put together a positive vision of what the truth actually is. Other thoughts, questions, reactions you guys have? Nope. Feeling good?
I'll say I liked this reading a lot more than Russell's.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I'm always interested in hearing about it. I always get a little bit on both sides of the fence. What'd you like about it?
And I think, well, the whole thing was one giant metaphor. And for a minute, with the first reading, I was kind of annoyed with the whole metaphor usage in it. But I think you explained it well when you said that they had basis for their knowledge. And so these metaphors help break it down for them in a really kind of dumb way. So using graphic examples can be dumbed down. It was actually almost difficult to see the big picture, not necessarily dumbed down. It was just so much to digest. It was so visual that it was hard to sift through for what he's actually trying to say. But now that I'm thinking of it more like that, it's a little bit easier for me to navigate. But I just like I like what he's saying more than Russell. Because I don't know, in a lot of ways they disagree in my book.
Oh, really?
With each other. Yeah.
What do you see as the major disagreements here between Russell and Plato?
Absolutes. I feel like Plato is talking in absolutes and Russell doesn't talk in absolutes.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. Yeah, Russell is much more like philosophy doesn't give us absolute answers, and Plato is way more optimistic about that. In fact, Plato's like I mean, you taste that good shit, and there is no going back. I mean, you can't unlearn what you see when you start doing philosophy. It's like when you encounter the form of the good, Plato thinks, there's not going to be any question or doubt. When you see the right answer, there's no way you're going to question like, is that really the truth? It's going to be like so obvious and in your face that it'll be undeniable. And this is one of the things I've got a problem with Plato about. That I'm like, I'm not so certain about that. I don't know if it's going to be like, you'll know when you see it. You'll know that that's the truth, sort of thing. But that's really how Plato thinks about it. It's not an intuition. He doesn't think that it's based on like human intuition that's going to like confirm or see what's correct. It's going to be more that like the truth just overpowers you in the same way that it's like um, with the same force that it sometimes feels to common sense to be like, there, I'm looking at a phone right now. How could I not be looking at a phone? This is real. This is what's happening right now is happening. It's kind of like that. Um, I mean, Plato really does think of reason as the perceptual faculty of the forms. It's not like we speculate about a reality we don't encounter. It's that we're getting it. Boom, right there. So, yeah, that's a good observation here about the difference between Plato and Russell. I'm always kind of intrigued by how much when it comes to the attitudes that they recommend about doing philosophy, they're kind of on the same page about it. Like all this stuff about freedom and bondage, from the tyranny of custom and desire and habits and that sort of thing. How like truth, just the truth seeking is an expression of freedom and leads you to freedom. That they got so much in common on those things, even though they disagree about a very fundamental issue, like whether we can know what's ultimately true. Like I think that's kind of interesting. Maybe it means that that belief doesn't matter as much. Alexa says that she likes Plato more than Russell because Russell seems more biased, while Plato builds everything from the ground up and has great logical constructs. I'd say of the two of them, Plato's giving us less argument than Russell is. Russell tries to make a case a little bit. I mean, he definitely has room to do it more. I mean, both writings are more like manifestos than a like extended supported defense of a position. But Plato's just like, hey, check out this pretty picture. Doesn't that make sense? Like, doesn't that seem right? And I think Russell actually gives a little bit more by way of explicit argumentation. I actually, maybe we'll close off on this. Uh, I wanted to talk about bias with you guys at some point during this week, or sometime soon. If I didn't do it this week, sometime soon. Because it's really connected with critical reasoning. As soon as someone tells you about like you should be a critical thinker, you're probably one of the first things you're going to think about as a part of critical thinking is like recognizing bias and avoiding it. Like don't be biased, don't have prejudices about how you think about certain topics. But I'm really worried about how we throw around this word bias, this concept of bias, and especially how quick we are to make the accusations about bias. In my experience, this is what I tell my critical reasoning students when we do a big extended thing on bias. I say, I think if I made the judgment of what bias means, just looking at people's behavior and their use of the word, then I think I would conclude that the word bias is defined as a perspective where we can recognize. Got it. Back. Okay, sorry guys. Right where my hard drive thing did its thing again. All right, I'm almost done. So, hour and 10 minutes of recording is plenty. So here's what I was saying. Right where I was picking up. I think if I was going to look at how people use the word bias in their everyday life, I would conclude that the definition of bias is we use it when we see a pattern in someone's thinking and we don't like it. That's bias to us. And bias is, I think, a better definition of it, one that's more true to what the concept really has going on here, is that bias is something that's getting in the way of us seeing clearly. It's something that distorts our ability to get at the truth. It's something that when we're taking the efforts at trying to do this whole truth-seeking thing, bias is something that gets into that process and screws it up. It's really, bias is something that is often going to be connected with some kind of insincerity or some like ignorant blind spot or something like that. And most of the time we don't really back up that accusation of bias by being like, here is the bias. Here's the thing that's getting into your thinking that's keeping you from seeing what's true. The fact that someone has a strong opinion about something doesn't mean that they're biased. A lot of times the accusations of bias that we make are just for the things that people are saying, this is what I think is true. I mean, they're purposefully putting themselves into this perspective. So I think we gotta be careful. We gotta hesitate about this accusation of bias. It's something that's going on internally with someone's thought process too. That it's really hard for us to be able to have the evidence that we would need to come to that conclusion. So I encourage that on all of you guys to be careful about it. Critical reasoning, we talk about this more, and what bias, how you can detect what bias is and the different forms of bias that emerge. Those are things to keep an eye on for. Certainly, I mean, a bias we know that we all have very easily that we want to keep an eye out for is the ego. The things that fit with what makes us happy or what we like or prefer, we're going to be partial to. That's something that happens. And that's a good thing to be concerned about. But it's also not something to get too paranoid about too. Especially, here's the other thing about bias. If someone is making, they're making a claim that something is true, and they're giving an argument for it, then at least we should deal with the argument. Like this thing that's supposed to prove that the conclusion is true. To just accuse the person of bias is not to address or respond to that argument. The argument is supposed to stand or fall on its own. To talk about the person's character or and this kind of accusation of bias, which bias is something that attaches to the person, then that's something that would be distracting away from the argument, that wouldn't be focusing attention where it ought to be. It's the same sort of thing that happens with ad hominem, where you do a personal attack on the person instead of responding to their argument. So for all those reasons, I encourage healthy hesitancy in making the accusation of bias. That's something to be careful about. Remember when I talked about the code of intellectual conduct, I said, in my experience, the moment at which a debate heads south and becomes destructive and problematic and unhealthy and abusive is right at that moment where one party or the other starts to suspect that the other person is not arguing in good faith or is insincere. And that's certainly something we could be worried about if we're worried that bias is present. But also, when someone accuses us of bias, it might just be something that we're like, you're not really interested in listening to what I have to say, and you're looking for a way to dismiss it or write it off. And I want to encourage all of us not to operate that way. Listening is good. Just like that friend I was talking to on the bus. That's important. So I think I'll leave you with that tonight, guys. Thanks for sticking around for the whole shebang and through all the wacky stuff that happened. Thanks for another good night of video chatting. And if you guys have anything else to add, you want to ask right now? Yeah, I did have the code word. I put it in there. I'm not going to say it again now, so people can't just skip to the end of the video to get it. Oh, yeah, man, okay. Fine. I'm not going to police things too much. No, they can't see the chat in the video. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess I will sign off here and stop the video. Video people, see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.